I wonder if there's an issue about the word coach, because I wonder whether coaching in business is different to coaching in sport, in the sense that we had a great podcast with David Clutterbuck. You know, he's one of the greatest coaches or business coaches around.
Hmm.
And he's beginning to talk about what if everything we know about coaching is wrong. And he is saying the thing that's missing in business coaching is relationship building. The business coaching is very focused on process. And if you were a business coach, the business coaches I work with might see their client once every couple of months. In the world of sport, when you were at Feyenoord, you saw your players every day. And, I think that's quite a big difference. You're building quite a different relationship. And I think maybe business can learn from that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think certainly in the world of sport, we've got some great researchers here, as John would testify to, people like Professor Sophia Jowett, who's talked a lot over the years and researched a lot, is the world's leading researcher possibly in this area of coach-athlete relationships. I think inside or outside of academic work on this area, you think back to the greatest coaches, sports coaches of all time. Often they're the ones talking about transformational coaching rather than anything else. It's about relationships. Is a big part of it. So I I think this is inbuilt into sports coaching, and it's interesting what you're saying that the world of business coaching, which I'm not a huge expert on. I've read business coaching books, and I've done some various courses over the years where business coaches have it's predominantly been business coaches, like courses in solution focused brief therapy. And to speak to your point, they do feel a little bit more process oriented, and I've always wondered if that's just the pragmatic nature of, people have got to dish out money for a
Yeah.
coach, and so it restricts the possibility to build a relationship. So I think it's kind of looking at the best of both worlds. I think where sports coaching can be a little bit different is the need for the coach to really have a very deep knowledge of their domain. Like if you want to be a football coach and then be an excellent football coach, you have to have a real deep knowledge of football. I know that sounds really obvious, but there's people out there who take various approaches to coaching. There's one form of motor skill learning called ecological dynamics, where they talk about using your expertise lightly and not really necessarily having to know a lot about the sport itself. But the vast majority of people out there would say, as a sports coach, you really need to know a lot about sports you're coaching. If you're a golf coach, know about golf. If you're a tennis coach, you've got to have qualifications as a tennis coach to know about tennis. You've probably got to have a rich history in tennis. And that feels to me the most obvious area in terms of the difference between the two. Because as a business coach, I would imagine you could walk into banking and you could walk into law and you could walk into accounting, and nobody really asks you to have a deep knowledge of those areas, right? Um, Although I'm sure there's business coaches who have specialisms out there who might have a deeper knowledge. But to speak to your eminent guest's point, I think that's interesting, and absolutely what is talked a lot about in the world of sports coaching is the importance of relationships. I actually think sometimes overzealously so. I also think there's an importance of coaches knowing more about skill acquisition and coaching science, and knowing how to coach. And I think there's too many coaches out there who have a deep knowledge of their sport, but don't necessarily have a deep knowledge of the process of coaching. So I think there's an interesting juxtaposition between the two worlds.
I you see that sometimes. It's almost like that kind of the I've done some football coaching badges and stuff like that, and before I realised I was never gonna get that far in it, not enough to carve out a career that would get a mortgage anyway. So like, but the thing that always interested me, I suppose, because I was starting out my lecturing career at the same time, was how little pedagogy is in coaching qualifications. Like how you, it's okay to say, right, when the play shifts that way, I want you to, take up a position between that person and that person. But if there isn't that kind of explanation of why, and a little bit of kind of passing on that autonomy, and it's just trust me, I know my stuff. You don't, because you're just a young fool. Right? Without that kind of pedagogical skill of trying to teach someone to understand, for myself, this is why that's a good position, and for them to really believe it and want to adopt it, then it's never going to happen kind of almost subconsciously. It's always going to be, oh, he wants me to go there, which would probably always be, half a second too late and stuff like that. So it kind of always interests me that sometimes coaching can be, and there's some coaches that are just fabulous at it as well. But yeah, sometimes a little bit procedural and perhaps not enough kind of you don't get that. So when if you're doing teaching qualifications, you learn a lot about like Socratic questioning and stuff like that, and trying to bring people through. Would that reflect experience? Is that?
Very, very much so. Many sports are too entrenched around, if we think about, you're talking about the what and the how here, sports coaching might be quite strong on the what to coach, although you could argue that too often the what to coach is based on people's former careers in the game. Like they tend to coach what they've been taught in their own careers. Broad brush statement there. So a football coach who's been a successful player might coach in the style and might coach what they've experienced from a manager or head coach they've had in the past. But to speak to your point, it's the how to coach. How do I coach this? Even if I've got a deep understanding of the game and I have a vast array of what to coach and knowledge I want to give to my players, it's how am I gonna pass that information on? And there is very little pedagogical education. It's not to say it doesn't exist in, say, the coaching badges across sports, but you could argue there's not enough, and so not enough coaches are subject to coach science and skill acquisition, and when you mesh those two together, in essence, now we're talking about three approaches to pedagogy. It's the information processing approach, which might be seen as a more traditional approach of explicit instruction or direct instruction, in essence, in very simple terms, me telling you what to do, but also utilizing other forms like modeling, questioning, so on and so forth. Then there's the ecological dynamics approach, which has, I can't go into much detail there, but it is very much about non-linear pedagogy and helping the athlete to find their own movement solutions and to regulate themselves and being a guide as a coach. And then there's a center ground, which is a games-based approach that has a rich history since the 1960s, which is very much teaching the sport through a series of games. But you can still explicitly coach, and you can ask questions, and you can give players different experiences to be able to learn the game. So not enough coaches really have a deep knowledge of these areas of skill acquisition and coach science, and they don't have a deep knowledge necessarily of basic teaching skills like utilizing spectrum of coaching styles, utilizing Rosenshine's principles of instructions, all things that are used in the classroom that could also be incorporated out onto the training pitch as well. So you're quite right. There's so many things that there's so many pedagogical areas that aren't necessarily utilized on these coaching courses, and so sports coaching isn't good enough at the moment. It really, and that's not me being offensive to anybody. When I was a golf coach, I wasn't good enough. What was golf coaching to me? It was knowing a lot about the golf swing. It was having this serious technical knowledge that I could tell you, John, that you're standing there and you're doing a reverse pivot, and I might have a drill to help you reverse pivot, but then it's not necessarily utilizing specific pedagogical approaches to help you to shift your movement or to learn the game. So yeah, you are quite right. I think we're going off down a rabbit hole here, but it's an area where sports coaching needs to get a lot better.
And I think I like rabbit holes. No apologies for that. But one of the things that I see you do very well, Dan, is when you look at those kind of processes of coaching, kind of allowing people to see where there's kind of that interaction for that biopsychosocial piece in there. So it's funny how I do, as I'm sure a million other sports psychologists do, but like I love to do this thing with teams at the start where I write down on the flip chart like technical, tactical, physical, mental. How much of success in your sport is down to those? And they put down something that sometimes adds up to 100. A lot of people leave school early in sport. So, but then I'll ask them, okay, so what proportion of your training effort goes into them? And essentially, when the mental bit ends up with a small score, and they'll go, see, that's my justification. I can add something, but I take that on a step further then, and I try and explain, well, actually, what is tactical knowledge? Like thinking strategically, isn't that a lot of mental skill? What is not like understanding the technique, but knowing how you execute the technique in a certain situation? If it's physical and it requires endurance, what kind of skills, And so I suppose what I'm getting at is when I see you kind of regularly talk about biopsychosocial approaches, would you just be able to spend a moment sort of explaining what you mean by that? Why are so many things that we encounter, we can stick with sport, make things look
and I'll start by answering that by saying I've historically done the same thing as you. I've got people to think about the technical side of the game, the tactical side of the game, the physical side of the game, and the mental side of the game, and get them to apportion a percentage in terms of importance. I think that's a really neat and handy way to persuade people in front of you, to get them at least thinking about the proportions and what they might do. I think it's good, and I think it's taking that reductionist lens. Similarly, we can be quite robust, and we can take the helicopter viewpoint and be more holistic here. And to speak to what you're saying, those things being meshed together, there's a lot of complexity there, and you can't really take the mental, the psychological away from the technical, tactical, physical. And that's the complexity of it, isn't it? And a lot of my writing is based on this, in essence, an idea of embodied cognition, the embodied notion of our mental processes, and that actually what is technical without mental? Technical is mental, psychological, and psychological is technical, and tactical is psychological. And because it's all about, learning and knowing and acting on what we know and what we don't know, and the capacity to concentrate in order to execute the tactical side. It's very difficult to separate. So I think on the one hand, as practitioners, to be able to persuade, we might take that reductionist viewpoint, do that reductionist exercise, whilst also understanding that they're so meshed together and holistic in nature. Biopsychosocial. And so you've probably seen historically where I've written on LinkedIn, and I've talked to people written about my biopsychosocial model of coaching. Not a particularly a great title for a model, not very catchy. With going back earlier about me trying to make things in catchy terms, but the biopsychosocial model of coaching. But this idea is, again, and in essence, I love what the English FA do and have done over the years. And at the same time, I've kind of been, a bit pushy backy on their four corner model, where they separate, and the technical, tactical, the physical, the social, and the psychological is their four corners. And I'm going, you know what, let's actually break this up and let's put the technical, tactical, and physical in 3 boxes. But underneath those boxes is this big box of biopsychosocial, because nobody denies in every single sport, technical exists, tactical exists, physical exists. You know, you could even say in a more sedentary sport like darts, there's technical, there's tactical, there's physical, right? How physical they were in the 1980s with Eric Bristow and Jockey Wilson, I don't know, but you know. yeah, lifting right. They still had to stand up and throw the dart. There's a physical element to it, but every sport has these 3 components. What I'm coming along and saying is biopsychosocial exists every single second. It is omnipresent, and it is constantly pressuring and influencing technical, tactical, physical. And technical, tactical, physical is constantly influencing and pressurizing biopsychosocial. And so what is biopsychosocial? In essence, it's our human makeup. Every human being is made up of the biological, the psychological, and the social. And human behavior is informed in that way. It's informed biologically, and that can be as minuscule as our brain's neurons, our brain cells. It could be the hormones that we're releasing. It can be our blood pressure. It can be our heart rate. All of these things combine our biology. It could be it's still our muscular skeletal makeup. It's our metabolism. All of these things pressure our psychology, and what, it's the things we're talking about: the confidence, the concentration, the commitment. If we're thinking about sports psychology here, our personality, and so on and so forth. Our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, if you like. And biopsycho aspects are influenced by our social. Okay, our social world, our socio-cultural aspects around us, our schooling, our peers, our friends, our work colleagues, our teachers, our broader community. Do we go to a religious facility every single week? So our spouses and so on and so forth. So biopsychosocial are 3 components rolled into one, constantly interacting, constantly pressurizing human behavior, and human experience, human functioning, human learning, human performance, that is in turn constantly pressurizing technical, tactical, physical. Quite complex, right? And so this is what we have to bear in mind. So when we observe as coaches human behavior, we have to understand and appreciate that human behavior is biopsychosocially informed. It is complex, and I'm sorry that it's complex, but that is the nature. And that's why we don't get it right all the time. That's why we fail often. And I'm happy to put my hands up and say, yeah, things go wrong. Things don't always work out. I don't get things right all the time, no matter how skilled you get as a coach. But that's why we love this area, right? That's why we love coaching. That's why we love researching this. That's why we love the models that we create in order to help us make sense of these complex areas. So that's what I would say to biopsychosocial, if that makes any semblance of sense.
I love that. And I love that you just embraced that. Look, it is complex because people are complex and situations are complex. And I'm not going to try and just distill this down and give you a couple of quick words. So yeah, and look, the beauty of a podcast is someone can just scroll it back a little bit and listen to it again. Because I promise you, that's gold.
I guess I've got one last question for you, Dan, and that's we've recently had the Olympic Games, and one of the things that the Olympic Games does is every 4 years, suddenly everyone becomes very aware of sport and sports they've never come across. And it's a way, you kind of spot with each Olympic Games that there's been some sort of development, some sort of recognition of something. What would you say we have learned from the recent Olympic Games?
Great question. What have we learned from the last Olympic Games? I think we continue to learn, and I think what I'm about to say, I go back and forward on this, and I think it's a continuum or a number of continuums, and it's complex. I think that in sports psychology, more and more now, we're talking about the importance of sophisticated approaches to competition, and that lots of things can exist and triumph can still happen depending on how you are defining triumph. And I think that definition is also in the mix of my sense making here. I think we need I think it's useful to have multiple definitions of success. I think historically, elite sports has always been about who can get on the podium and who can top that podium, and I think that needs to exist, and I think that can still exist. But also it's a celebration of human endeavor. It's a celebration of teamwork. It's a celebration of the world getting together. Without sounding too fluffy and flowery here, I think, we can appreciate and applaud efforts and camaraderie and especially, in today's current geopolitical landscape and all the challenges that are going on in the world, it's great to see the world get together and compete against each other, but enjoy competing against each other, and to see the camaraderie amongst competitors as well. I think you see that a lot, say, for example, in the gymnastics. There's a lot of those competitors have a lot of love for those who they're competing against. You notice that in sports like pole vaulting, for example, where there's enormous celebration amongst the competitors themselves for the achievements of their competition. That pole vaulter who got the world record, his name escapes me right now, but the Swede, is it Swede who got the world record, and just his competitors staying out there and enjoying the celebration. And so there's that. And in line with that, understand, and there's so many good people around my profession who are talking more about, again, more sophisticated approaches to how we discover how good we can be. And there's definitely the side of diligence and hard work and grit and stuff like that. But equally, there's the side of compassion and thriving and flourishing as human beings, and I suppose a little bit more towards the Martin Seligman's positive psychology end, and discovering how those kind of things interact with high performance and excellence, and that they can be a part of that journey. That perhaps those classic sort of one-dimensional historical approaches of just pure sacrifice and selfishness. I mean, there was interestingly, here's a learning point. There's been a lot of pushback. Was it the Nike advert or was it the Adidas advert? I'm gonna butcher this here, but there was an advert released by one of those main companies that was very much about hating your rival and this one-dimensional approach and being a hateful figure and being alone and practicing alone, and it's enormous amount of pushback on social media about it doesn't have to be that way. And so I think that that's starting to come through. Again, that doesn't mean that there can't be fierce rivalry. That doesn't mean that you don't have to really work hard and look at things in real granular detail to get to where you want to go. And it doesn't mean that there can't be and shouldn't be single-mindedness. But at the same time, I think it's an interesting world that says, can there be more cooperation as well as competition? How far can one take that? And can there be as many sophisticated approaches for lots of people to discover how good that they can be, that might be considered safe and healthy for human beings in those environments, without too much of a risk of burnout and uh, 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 to the detriment of people's mental health and well-being? Can people reach the podium without ill-being and ill mental health? And I think that that's what the Olympic Games is. I think certainly in the UK, that's where things are heading, and I think that that's a good thing.
Oh, completely agree. And I'm really relieved to hear you say that, because the person who made the most impact for me wasn't actually one of the athletes, a former athlete, and it was Michael Johnson commentating on events. And unlike a lot of the other commentators who did wax lyrical about getting on a podium and, the gold medalist was suddenly the hero or heroine of the day and nobody else got a mention, he actually spoke about people who didn't get on the podium. And he'd be talking about them achieving their personal best. And he'd be talking about the progress they'd made, over the last 3 or 4 years and where their potential might lie. And he often used the phrase, which originates with Jim Lower, of course, as these are people who are being the best version of themselves that they can be. And so that's pointing to your understanding of what does success look like. I may never get that gold medal, but hang on, I'm at the Olympics. I'm with my peers and I'm being the best that I can be. That is success.
Very well said.
I think that's probably a lovely warm way to kind of wrap things up.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, I could listen to you all day, Dan. I love the sense that the appreciation of a complicated answer, because it just feels more real, because once you talk to people, I would say I've never actually really got to know a simple person. Anyone that appears simple, I don't know them. Once you get to know them, everyone's complex. So yeah, I really appreciate that kind of dive into the nuance and really kind of trying to think about a great breadth of variables that might affect a situation and person.
Dan, I think that's been a great conversation and very thought-provoking. There are going to be people sitting there listening to this and saying, I never thought of it that way. And that's down to you. That's brilliant, Dan. You're obviously very thoughtful in your approach to your work. And I think it's going to shine through in this podcast.
I've been accused of overthinking things. I think the light side rather than the dark side of overthinking things is you can appreciate a little bit more complexity. So I'll take that.
Yeah. So if anybody wants to get in touch with you, perhaps to do a motivational speech or some sort.
Of me climbing up Everest with one arm. Yeah, okay.
How can they get hold of you?
And I don't mean offense to anybody out there. There's great motivational speakers. I thank you so much, gents. That really appreciate this conversation and your time and giving me the platform to have a conversation with you both. I really enjoyed it. DanAbrahams.com is my website. DanAbrahams.com. You can reach out to office@DanAbrahams.com. Office@DanAbrahams.com. I have a range of social media platforms. I write on LinkedIn and Facebook every day. LinkedIn, just Dan Abrahams, and Facebook @DanAbrahams Soccer. I have a range of X handles, but I'll give you one. @DanAbrahams77 is my main one, @DanAbrahams77. And Instagram @DanAbrahamsSport. My podcast, which you gents have been on, it was a brilliant episode, is The Sport Psych Show. I'm a distinctly average host, but I have great guests like yourselves that enable the podcast to be popular and good. So there's that. And yeah, I'd be delighted to hear from anybody.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks a million, Dan.
Thanks, guys.